is no such thing as a geologic column, and all of your argument is based on the idea that if you go deeper, we find different animals. Well, first of all, who's doing the checking and who gets to publish the material? It all has to match their religion.
Heard him laugh at the concept of a young Earth. And so he himself is a biased researcher. I'd prefer to leave it at that.
As you inspect the facts for yourself, it should become more and more obvious we are not dealing with people who want to discover and teach the truth of our Earth's history. We are dealing with people who are getting paid lots of money to push a very specific agenda and suppress anything that goes against the narrative.
This is not a video about creationism or evolution. This is a video about a particular claim made by some creationists that biologists are actively misleading the general public for nefarious reasons. That we are lying for profit, that all of evolutionary biology is a conspiracy, that we are blackmailing our colleagues that don't agree with us, that we are falsifying data to support a foregone conclusion. This is an accusation. It goes beyond science and theology. It is a character judgment, an outright attack on the people who have dedicated their lives to understanding the natural world. As an evolutionary biologist, it is a personal attack on myself, on my friends, colleagues, and mentors. It is an attack based on a fundamental misunderstanding on how science is actually done, how it is funded, and it belittles the trials and hardships faced by thousands of research scientists all around the world. It trivializes our research that we pour our blood, sweat, and tears into, boiling it down to nothing more than making up data so that we can march to the drumbeat of evolutionism and keep getting paychecks. Nothing could be further from the truth. In this video, I'm going to explain to you why this conspiracy theory is ridiculous and insulting. First, we will walk through the typical path anyone wanting to become a scientist must take. Second, we will talk about funding structures and how research labs actually operate. And finally, we will address this claim on an intellectual level, demonstrating how it is ultimately a lazy attempt to disregard anything they don't agree with. I want to state clearly, once again, that this is not an attack on all creationists or even on creationism. If you are a creationist watching this, know that the venom in my voice that you will hear at several points in this video is not directed at you or your beliefs specifically. It's only directed at those who accuse us of data falsification to serve some ideological purpose. With that said, let's get started. Virtually all evolutionary biologists start with an undergraduate education in biology, sometimes with an emphasis in ecology, conservation, evolution, or zoology, depending on the university they attend. The purpose of an undergraduate education is to teach you the basics, the fundamental ideas and facts that support them. You study out of textbooks, you sit in lectures, you take exams, etc. While a good undergraduate education should challenge you to think critically about what you are learning, often people have described their experiences as rote memorization. Nevertheless, obtaining an undergraduate degree is no small achievement. In biology, it's required that you take advanced courses in chemistry, physics, statistics, and mathematics. A common theme among biology students is the horror that we all had to endure for 2 semesters in organic chemistry. Some undergrads are exposed to research labs, but not all. Those Those that are typically perform predefined roles, such as basic laboratory maintenance, molecular bench work, which is just a fancy term for things like extracting DNA, etc. They rarely are engaged in projects that require them to conjure the entire idea from start to finish, though there are certainly some that do. Ultimately, obtaining an undergraduate degree comes down to dedication. How well did you study and retain the information you were given? Most Americans have some college experience. Even if you didn't finish college, you have a passing familiarity with the process. It's not that different from high school, after all. You sit in a lecture, you study, you take an exam, you get a degree. Again, many undergrads do a lot more than this, and I'm not trying to shortchange their efforts, just describe in fairly simple terms the typical experience. The next steps to becoming a scientist are dramatically different. Much fewer Americans have experience with graduate school, and it's reflected in the common trope among academics captured in the phrase, "My parents don't know what I do." Unlike undergrads, grad students are required to design, implement, and carry out a study that will contribute something fundamentally novel to science. What they do is not written in textbooks. They are doing the work that may one day appear in textbooks. They are doing research that has never been done before, the success of which will ultimately dictate whether or not they achieve their desired degree. Most classes in grad school are technical or discussion oriented, and you only take classes your first semester or two tops. You may learn how to use a specific statistical software package or participate in a reading group that reviews the technical literature within a particular field. Long gone are the days of reading textbooks. Any graduate student can tell you that those textbooks that you spent years studying are really just simplifications of the technical literature meant to build a foundation. Once that foundation is established, you never return to such introductory books. Now you're at the forefront of the scientific enterprise. That forefront is the technical literature. That's where all the novel discoveries are first recorded, discussed, and debated. News articles take the technical literature and they try to disseminate it to the masses, but it always requires grossly oversimplifying the methods and results of the original paper. Graduate students, both master's and doctoral, are carrying out research that will eventually be published in this technical literature. Indeed, some programs require you have published your study before you can even graduate. Graduate students typically work under what's called a PI, which is short for principal investigator. This person is simultaneously their boss and their mentor. They may or may not receive direct funding from this person. The PI helps to guide the student, but does not dictate what they do. Ultimately, it's up to the student to carry out the research. They must also form a committee, which is a panel of other biologists that will assess their project at all stages. One of the most daunting tasks all doctoral students must go through is the preliminary exam, which is an oral and written exam administered by the committee that tests your knowledge of the broader field as well as your specific knowledge regarding your proposed research. Passing this exam is called advancing to candidacy, which transitions a PhD student to a PhD candidate. Graduate students are both researchers and teachers, as many of them juggle serving as teaching assistants with carrying out their own research, depending on how much funding their lab has. More on that later. Once a student has completed their research project, they then undergo what's called a defense. This is a public presentation of your research, including your methods, results, interpretations, etc., which is followed by a second examination of the candidate by their committee. The committee then votes on whether you passed this examination, in which case you have successfully defended your dissertation. Your ability to defend your dissertation is not something you can learn from a textbook. It's not something a lecturer can teach you or that you can just watch on YouTube. It's not even something you can learn from reading the technical literature. You had to get your hands dirty. You had to go out in the field to learn the techniques yourself through trial and error until you understood them at a level beyond that of your mentor or committee. Indeed, normally by the time you defend your dissertation, you are an expert in that topic. It's unlikely anyone on the planet knows more about it than you, because by its very nature, you are contributing something fundamentally new to science. If all this sounds intimidating, it's because it is. It's meant to be challenging, to push you to the very edge of your intellectual abilities and then force you to go beyond. Even still, the journey is just beginning. After obtaining a PhD, you typically find what are called postdoctoral positions, which is what I currently hold, which are specialized research positions in which a lab hires you to lead, design, or collaborate on a project that they've recently received funding for. Unlike graduate students, postdocs are not funded by the university and thus must rely on the lab they are working with to obtain and maintain a grant of some kind, which includes funding for them. These positions are typically 1 to 2 years long, and any given researcher may go through several postdoc positions. The purpose of them is to give you more time to build your resume, to add more technical publications to your record in hopes that you will eventually find a full-time position at a university. Note, many researchers may take government, NGO, or private positions, but for simplicity, I'm just talking about individuals on the academic track. Now, most biologists that are on this academic track are first hired at an assistant professor level, which is a pre-tenure position. In many ways, this position may be the most trying for a scientist yet. Now you have become the PI. You are responsible for leading a lab, hiring postdocs, advising students, developing courses, acquiring grants to fund your research, carrying out that research, etc. However, looming over your head is this knowledge that you are effectively still contractual. Until you acquire tenure, you can be terminated once your contract is up. Acquiring tenure is a process that involves creating a so-called tenure packet, which is the body of work that fundamentally distinguishes you as a scientist. How many publications do you have? What is the impacts of those publications? How successful have your students been? How many grants have you managed to obtain? All of these things go into your tenure packet, which is then read and judged by a committee of professors in your department to vote on whether or not to offer you tenure. If you do not get it, it does not always indicate you will lose your job, but it's often taken that way. And generally those denied tenure start looking for a new job elsewhere to start the process all over again. Tenure is the final step on the academic track. It's the point at which your career finally provides you with a bit of breathing room. It's the point where you can ask riskier questions with greater probability of failure because you have job security. By the time most people get tenure, assuming they follow this academic trajectory from high school straight through to professorship, they're in their mid to late 40s, already halfway through their lives. The entire process may take 20 plus years. And at any point during that time, the probability of failure is exceptionally high. As I said before, a tenure track position is not the goal of every scientist. It's the one I'm most familiar with, but there are many avenues to do research, and private industry jobs are becoming more enticing for many researchers because of the promise of better pay. Which leads us into the second point: how much money scientists actually make.
Now, you might be asking yourself, why would all these scientists just lie? Don't they want to find the truth? Well, the answer is actually quite simple: money. You see, scientists' entire career are financially motivated to confirm these bones they find are some form of transitional fossil that proves evolution. If they can't prove that, they don't get the grants. The financial motivation comes from several sources, but it's mostly from government grants, books, interviews, documentaries, and everything else that comes with the fame and notoriety of discovering something that can be used for the evolution theory. Once the scientists claim their discovery fits the evolution theory, usually the government funding is extended or new grants are approved so that they can continue their research.
I hold a PhD in evolutionary biology and am employed as a postdoctoral researcher. My salary is $60,000 a year before taxes. The median income in the US for a single earner is $51,000 a year. And then in the state of Michigan, where I live, it's $52,168. Thus, despite holding a specialized technical degree that required almost 10 years of schooling, I only make an average of $7,800 more a year than the median earner in the state that I live. That's hardly an impressive number. So what about professors? The United States average for biology professors is $80,000 a year. That includes both pre- and post-tenure positions, and the variation is pretty high. In the South, for example, the median falls to under $60K a year, which is less than what I make as a postdoc, but can rise to over $100K a year in states like California and New York. Obviously, the largest impact on salary is the cost of living in the area where the university is located. So the question is, are the numbers so enticingly high that scientists would just throw away their integrity for it? Remember, we're talking about people who got into this field because they were passionate about it. They endured all the grueling years of graduate school, the insecurities of postdoc positions, the uncertainty as assistant professors, all so that they could make slightly more than the median household income. Is it really reasonable that they did so just so they could lie and mislead? Now, let's talk about grants. Creationists making these claims often throw around the assertion that the grant writing process requires us to affirm evolution if we hope to receive said grant. This is just silly. Let me illustrate with an example using a grant that my position is funded through. Our funding comes from the National Institutes of Health. Let's have a look at the structure of this document. So this is the publicly available project details for the grant that I'm funded under. For all grants that are given out by the NIH, that are awarded by the NIH, you can go to reporter.nih.gov to find. There's a similar search database for the NSF as well, which is the National Science Foundation. What I want to do is just read you a little bit about the project details through the abstract text so that you can get an idea of the sort of things that the NIH are funding and hopefully make it clear to you that these are not ideological documents. So this is called Incorporating Geography into Statistical Methods for Analysis of Population Genomic Data. And let's look a little bit at the abstract. So in humans, genetic variation is distributed geographically, reflecting the history of human movements across the continents. Understanding these spatial patterns is crucial for many fields in population genomics, including the study of human evolutionary history and linking genotypes and phenotypes. Historically, limitations in the size and scope of empirical datasets have allowed researchers to employ models that ignore geography. But modern genomic datasets demand population genetic methods that incorporate geographic space. The proposed research will generate novel statistical methods that incorporate geography into the study of population genetic structure, admixture, demography, and natural selection. These methods will be developed and implemented as open source software, validated using state-of-the-art forward time simulations, and applied to publicly available genomic datasets. As an aside, I'm very excited. This is what we've been doing for the past year, and we have managed to develop this method, which we should release in a preprint, hopefully before Christmas or just after Christmas. Okay, back to the abstract. We will develop tests for a population admixture that explicitly account for geographic patterns due to isolation by distance. These tests will be used to analyze densely sampled Eurasian human genomic datasets to identify admixed samples, and will also be used in sliding windows along the genome to highlight genomic regions that may have been transferred between populations via adaptive introgression. We will also develop a spatiotemporal population clustering method that can jointly analyze ancient and modern samples. Neutral genetic processes are expected to generate population differentiation between samples separated in space or time, so this clustering method will account for both when determining whether two samples share ancestry in the same discrete population. This method will be extended to detect selection on polygenic traits by testing for an aggregate increase in the frequency of alleles involved in a particular trait relative to the neutral expectation. We will apply this method to test for selection through time on human height across Eurasia. Finally, we will model the links of shared genomic segments between individuals, which are informative about genealogical overlap at different points in the past. To learn about how population density and dispersal patterns have changed across geographic space through time. The proposed work represents advances in a number of fields in statistical population genetics, including the detection of population admixture, adaptive introgression, population replacement, and the joint analysis of DNA from ancient and modern samples, detecting selection on polygenic traits, and modeling heterogeneity in demographic processes through time. Taken together, this work will offer empirical researchers a valuable toolkit for the analysis of modern genomic data sets, which require spatially explicit methods, and will shed light on both human evolutionary history and the mechanisms by which humans have adapted to their environment across space and time. So I know that was pretty dense. And again, this is just the abstract. I'm not even showing you the full grant proposal. But all we do in that full proposal is we break down each one of these things in like really, really technical detail. But as an overview, that's what this grant is. We're building statistical models to then apply it to human genetic data sets. Furthermore, you can scroll down, you can see how it relates to things like public health. You can see who the PI is, who was the handling officer. You can see the organization it was awarded to. You can also go down and see how much was awarded and how that funding is being allocated to direct costs versus indirect costs. And then what they do is every single time there's a publication that has been funded by this particular grant, it appears here. So since we've gotten this grant, these are all the publications that have appeared under it. And yeah, like I said, this is freely available. Anybody can look this up for any grant that these federal agencies are funding, and you can find out exactly what we're doing, what we're proposing, and how much money is being allocated to us. Grants give background to the research question, propose the methods to investigate it, and generally provide a layout for a timeline for producing results and how that money will be spent, i.e. hiring postdocs, funding fieldwork, lab work, etc. As I just showed you, there's nothing remotely ideological about them. They are effectively research proposals, and they are evaluated, one, by the probability that that research will result in compelling results, and two, that the requested funding is necessary to carry out the research. Inherent in this claim is the insinuation that people voting to fund these projects are somehow gatekeeping science. They are requiring some sort of oath of allegiance to the established paradigm. There are several issues with this weird idea, notwithstanding the fact that virtually no biologist denies evolution. The committees that vote on these grants rotate, are composed of research scientists, and are often double-blind when reviewing the proposal itself. Thus, if so many biologists doubted evolution and were afraid of being blackmailed, they would have innumerous opportunities to serve on these committees completely anonymously, and therefore shift the paradigm without fear of reprisal. It's important to stress here that these grant committees are non-political. They don't represent any political party. They're not populated by politicians, and politicians have no say in who gets funded. The only thing politicians can dictate is how much funding is allocated to the agency in the first place. You may hear the claim, well, by the time they realized evolution wasn't true, it was too late. They'd already spent too much money, and so now they're stuck. This is called the sunk cost fallacy, the idea that you've sunk too much in to just back out now. The entire idea, as it relates to biology, is absolutely absurd, and it leads us to the third and final point, the intellectual laziness of the argument itself.
there are probably only 15 labs in all of America and another 30 labs worldwide that do radiometric dating. So it's a very closed circle. It's like a cult. It's like the Masonic order or the Illuminati or something like that.
In 2019, ecologist Kate Laskowski was informed by a fellow researcher that the data for a 2016 study that she'd been a co-author on had some irregularities. What does that mean exactly? Well, put simply, when data has been falsified, the variance tends to be smoother than what it looks like in nature. So you can explicitly test for this using simulations to detect how much of the variance deviates from expectations under randomness. The less random the variance in the data, the more suspicious that the data look. So Lakowski went back through the data, which had been given to her by a co-author by the name of Jonathan Pruitt, who was then at McMaster's University, and she was able to find that whole columns of data had been duplicated. Researchers started poring over his papers over the past decade, finding dozens of questionable patterns of variance. The scandal ultimately led to Pruitt resigning and the retraction of 13 papers, with another 6 presently listed under concern. This story serves to illustrate 2 key points. One is that scientists do not tolerate falsified data being used to support a foregone conclusion. While it took time for us to recognize the fraud, we eventually did and immediately began to investigate it. Secondly, there exists rigorous statistical measures for identifying falsified data. These measures can be applied to any data set to explicitly test the claim of falsification. I have never seen a creationist apply these methods. And that's because the argument is not a serious one, despite the fact that the accusation is serious. It's an obvious case of intellectual laziness. The tools exist for them to expose all of the supposed falsification of data, and yet they don't employ them. Why? Why else would they refrain from performing these simple statistical tests, other than that they used only a tiny fraction of their brain to vomit out this lazy claim in the first place? Finally, it displays a deep ignorance of how biological research is carried out to claim that we would no longer have jobs if evolution turned out to be false. I am trained to do a plethora of things that do not rely on the truth of evolution. I have extensive experience in molecular labs. I can assemble and analyze genomes. I can build statistical models, run bioinformatic pipelines, etc. None of those things necessarily rely on evolution being true. My job would be different if evolution was falsified, but I wouldn't be out of a job. So that I'm perfectly clear, this claim by some creationists is a very serious accusation. It cannot be made flippantly. If you're going to assert that scientists are working under nefarious motives, you better have some damn good evidence to back that up. That claim is an attack on our integrity. It's an attack on the research that we've dedicated our entire lives to, something that, quite frankly, you don't understand. You don't know what it's like to generate a completely novel prediction, design a way to test it, carry out that experiment, and then justify your results and methods to other experts, to put those results and ideas out into the ether to be criticized, scrutinized, analyzed by hundreds of other researchers who don't know you or care about your success. If you're going to claim that all the trials and tribulations that every scientist must go through is purely to support a fantasy, that our lives can be boiled down to falsification and the desire to mislead the public, it better be based on more than a fucking hunch. Otherwise, you're just a lazy, intellectually dishonest asshole.